December 1973, Philadelphia. A cold wind slicing through the streets outside the APA headquarters. Papers stacked high in solemn offices, whispers of change tension palpable. And then a single name erased from history yet alive in every conversation that dared to speak it. Homosexuality. No longer a disorder. A radical declaration that sent shockwaves through the corridors of psychiatry and the wider world. The official record, the DSM-2, once a tome of judgment, once a ledger of human difference labeled as disease, now suddenly altered, stricken from its pages. The room itself seemed to hold its breath as the resolution was read. We will no longer insist on labeling individuals as mentally ill when they are in fact healthy, without general impairment of social effectiveness. And yet outside the streets were unforgiving. The law still criminalized love communities, still cast stones, jobs still hung by a thread, families still whispered. Could a single act by a body of doctors redefine a nation's understanding of human identity? Could the courage of masked voices, anonymous yet defiant, pierce through decades of prejudice? 1 year earlier, a doctor face hidden voice, trembling yet firm, had proclaimed at the APA annual meeting, "I am homosexual. I am a psychiatrist." A declaration cloaked in secrecy, yet destined to ignite a revolution of thought. The shadows of the room, the flicker of lights over the assembled psychiatrists, the murmur of pens on paper, all waiting for what would come next. This was more than a decision. This was a confrontation, with centuries of fear, ignorance, and societal condemnation. The diaries, the letters, the hidden correspondences all pointed to a single truth. Something monumental was unfolding. Something that would echo through the streets of Philadelphia, through the halls of law, through the hearts of those who had been silenced for too long. And yet, as the gavel fell, a quiet dread lingered. For the world outside was not yet ready. For love, for truth, for recognition. November 1972. The APA annual meeting. New York City. A hall packed with white coats, polished shoes, the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering from corridors. Voices murmuring, papers rustling. And then a figure stepped forward, face hidden behind a mask, eyes visible yet cautious. Dr. H. Anonymous. Trembling hands gripping the podium. "I am homosexual. I am a psychiatrist." The words hung in the air, heavy, dangerous. Whispers spreading like wildfire among the rows of seated professionals. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Yellow cabs cutting through rain-slicked streets, neon signs flickering the hum of subways beneath. But inside, the air was thick. Tension, fear, anticipation. One could almost hear the centuries of judgment pressing down the shadow of early psychiatric manuals, the echoes of 19th century classifications, the countless voices that had labeled love as sickness. Meanwhile, across the United States, in small towns and cities alike, ordinary lives were constrained by law and custom. State statutes criminalizing homosexual acts, families whispering warnings, neighbors pointing fingers, children learning early that some affections were forbidden. And yet in quiet apartments and basements lit by a single lamp, activists like Barbara Giddings and Frank Kameny plotted, wrote, strategized, connecting dots across a fractured nation, mailing newsletters, compiling petitions, keeping diaries that would one day become evidence of resistance. The year 1973 dawned cold and gray. Streets dusted with frost, the hum of morning traffic echoing against brick facades. Inside APA offices, committees gathered. Debates raged. Some voices shrill with indignation, others calm yet firm, insisting on science, on evidence, on human dignity. And then, on December 15th, the decision came. Papers were stamped, minutes recorded, and a quiet revolution was codified. But the world outside did not immediately bend to this new truth. Bars closed, early jobs remained, fragile landlords withheld leases, families recoiled. Society had not yet caught up with the pronouncement inside those hallowed halls. The dichotomy was stark. One room, one document, one decision, versus an entire nation steeped in fear, prejudice, and centuries of misconception. And through it all, the masked doctor, the activists, the clandestine correspondences, all threads weaving a tapestry of courage, secrecy, and quiet defiance. A battle not of guns and armies, but of belief, of science, of recognition. And as the winter wind howled outside, the city seemed unaware. Yet history had quietly shifted, imperceptibly, irrevocably, setting the stage for change, one page, one word, one declaration at a time. The official records of the American Psychiatric Association, archived in yellowing folders, typewritten pages, ink fading. They tell a story of centuries-old prejudice, of classifications codified in DSM-1 and DSM-2, homosexuality listed among sociopathic personalities, mental disorders considered a deviation, a disease. Doctors consulted case studies, clinical notes. Patients labeled lives constrained. One page reads, patient exhibits persistent same-sex attraction. Social adjustment impaired. Another entry, singular occurrence of homosexual behavior noted. Fate unknown. Prognosis guarded. And yet beyond the sterile language, beyond the clinical detachment, letters and diaries from practitioners hint at dissent. Dr. John Fryer hiding behind the mask of H. Anonymous kept meticulous notes, his hand trembling as he chronicled the fear of speaking out the isolation, the knowledge that truth itself could jeopardize career and safety. A letter dated November 12, 1972 from Barbara Giddings to the APA committee. We implore you to recognize that these individuals are not diseased, their lives are not broken, their dignity intact. We offer evidence, testimony, and lived experience. News outlets of the time recorded reactions, some shocked, some outraged, some cautiously optimistic. The New York Times article typed on thin newsprint headlined, APA debates homosexuality. A shift in psychiatric thought. Reporters noted the tension, the whispers in the hall, the gravity of decisions that could ripple through the law and social perception. Even internal memos reveal the struggle, researchers citing surveys, letters from patients describing persecution, loss of employment, family rejection. All criteria for mental disorder, one report noted, must include distress or impairment in social function. And yet, the evidence suggests these individuals live fulfilling lives, in many cases excelling in social and professional spheres. And here the contradiction is stark. The archival documents betray their own authority, revealing the gap between codified judgment and lived reality. The minutes of the December 15, 1973 APA meeting record. The debate arguments made, objections raised, votes cast. One line stands out. It is the consensus of the committee that homosexuality in itself does not meet the criteria of mental disorder. The gavel falls. A decision recorded for posterity. But the documents themselves, silent witnesses to struggle, to fear, to courage. To historians, these files are more than paper. They are proof that a single act of institutional acknowledgement can alter the trajectory of countless lives, yet also a reminder that law, society, and custom do not instantly follow. Every name in the records, every note, every letter, a human life contained, compressed, observed, and among them the hidden voices, patients who risked exposure by sharing diaries, personal accounts, activists who gathered statistics, documented discrimination, wrote letters to newspapers, all converging to form the evidence that would dismantle centuries of classification. And even now, as we read these records, as we hear the echoes of typewriters, the rustle of papers, the faint murmur of conference rooms, we feel the weight of history pressing through, a truth long suppressed finally emerging. Yet the shadows linger. For each documented victory, countless untold stories remain, lives hidden, censored, silenced, waiting. Across the streets of Philadelphia, in apartments dimly lit by a single lamp, ordinary lives were quietly resisting erasure. The hum of radiators, the distant squeal of trolley brakes. A child whispered questions to a parent unaware of the risks of truth. Why can't I love who I want? And the answer, if spoken aloud, could fracture a family, a community, a life. In kitchens, handwritten letters sprawled across counters, ink smudged from trembling hands, words of defiance and hope interwoven with fear. Frank Kameni's notes describe the exhaustion of constant vigilance, the vigilance required just to survive, to hold a job, to maintain a home, to love without persecution. Barbara Giddings's diary reveals sleepless nights, pacing apartments, rewriting petitions, organizing demonstrations, calling every friend, every ally, every sympathetic psychiatrist. We fight not only for ourselves, she wrote, but for those who cannot speak, for those silenced by fear. Families huddled around radios listening for news of the APA's deliberations. Each broadcast, each article, a potential threat. Yet a glimmer of hope. Some whispered legends in the shadows, tales of the masked doctor. A figure moving unseen through the corridors of power, challenging authority with words alone. A modern folklore growing amidst cold fluorescent lights and the scent of old books. Teenagers hiding in closets listening to whispered conversations on rotary phones. Learning from activists that their feelings were not sickness, but identity. That their love was valid, their desires not criminal. In bars tucked into side streets away from prying eyes, conversations flowed with cautious relief. Stories of friends fired for being themselves, neighbors shunning them, lovers hiding from the law. Yet in these spaces, laughter mingled with tears. Courage was forged in whispered confessions, and in some communities, rumors spread. Tales of haunted psychiatric wards, of spirits of those condemned wandering empty hallways. Ghostly echoes of doctors and patients silenced for centuries. Stories whispered in hushed tones. He who spoke the truth, masked and anonymous, walks among us still, unseen, watching. A folklore layer intertwining with fact, a poetic justice imagined by those seeking comfort in myth. The human toll was tangible. Parents secretly supporting children, lovers writing letters never to be sent, activists attending meetings in secret notebooks clutched ready to record any sliver of progress. The world outside seemed oblivious, indifferent. The cold streets, the factory whistles, the clatter of subway cars. Yet inside these intimate spaces, a revolution of the heart was underway. each smile shared in defiance, each tear wiped in silence, each note carefully preserved, a testament to resilience, to courage, to survival. And the irony was palpable. As APA officials debated terminology and classification, entire communities were living the consequences, each action recorded, each injustice noted, each triumph quietly celebrated. In basements, activists held clandestine gatherings sharing stories of patients of colleagues who risked careers to speak out. Some stories became legend. A masked doctor appearing in lecture halls unseen but impactful. Words that carried further than any gun, any law, any statute, whispered across corridors, across cities, across generations. Families teaching children to read between the lines of history, to understand courage hidden in footnotes, in minutes, in diary entries. A grandmother recounting how her nephew, shunned by relatives, found solace in the letters of Dr. Anonymous, teaching him that identity was not a crime, that existence was a right. And through it all, the duality of human experience unfolded, fact and folklore entwined, real fear and imagined heroism dancing in the same shadow, each human scene layered with nuance, tragedy tempered with hope, isolation interwoven with solidarity, the tactile, the intimate, the cinematic, pens scratching paper clocks ticking in empty rooms, footsteps echoing on narrow stairwells, a heartbeat pulsing through every frame of lived history. And as winter deepened outside, the warmth of human resilience burned quietly in apartments, basements, kitchens, and hidden offices. The true story of survival, of defiance, of humanity asserting itself against centuries of erasure. This was not merely a narrative of classification, but a tapestry of lived lives, a mosaic of whispers and letters, smiles and tears. Courage both mundane and extraordinary, and through these human scenes, the stakes became clear. The APA's decision was more than a page in a book. It was a lifeline cast into a sea of fear, and the people who lived it, who breathed it, who whispered it, were its beating heart. The files once hidden in dusty cabinets reveal a labyrinth of contradictions. Memos marked confidential letters sealed with wax, patient records coded with numbers instead of names. Each page whispers secrets of lives scrutinized, lives constrained. Dr. Fryer's notes, carefully preserved under lock and key, recount late nights filled with anxiety and resolve. I speak masked. I exist hidden. Yet truth persists. The typed lines tremble with the weight of danger, each word a risk. Outside newspapers reported cautiously. The Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Post headlines small but precise: APA considers new classification for homosexuality. Experts divided. Yet the stories barely captured the lives behind the labels. The testimonies of patients, activists, and sympathetic psychiatrists filled the gaps. Letters from those silenced describing social exile, loss of employment, rejection by families. The cold isolation of cities where love was criminalized. And then the anomalies. Discrepancies between case notes and observed reality. Clinical observations noting distress. Yet the distress not from identity, but from persecution, from harassment, from fear of exposure. A singular pattern emerged, a fate unknown to many. Lives classified wrongly, freedom denied. These anomalies hidden in the archives became catalysts for change. Yet alongside these factual accounts, whispers of legend circulated. In the hallways of APA meetings, murmurs spoke of the masked doctor appearing unseen, of pens falling mysteriously from tables, of letters misplaced only to reappear months later. Some claimed objects would vanish from offices only to reappear in unexpected hands as if guided by unseen forces. These stories, folklore intertwined with fact, took on the aura of myth, a psychic echo of the fight against institutionalized fear. Activists like Barbara Giddings and Frank Kameny wrote tirelessly, yet some of their correspondences disappeared or were ignored, only to resurface years later. The gaps themselves became a motif. Silence punctuating history. The narrative of resistance layered atop the narrative of erasure. Evidence contradicted itself. And yet patterns revealed truth. One diary found decades later chronicled the secret meetings, the whispered encouragements to patients, the subtle defiance against colleagues who insisted on classification as disorder. In some entries, the language itself took on a poetic, almost eerie tone. The shadows in the office move differently when truth walks among us. Unseen, yet undeniable. The folklore was not mere fantasy. It was metaphor made tangible by secrecy, by fear, by the constant presence of eyes watching, recording, judging. The combination of hidden documents, lost correspondence, and whispered legends created a dense tapestry, a bridge between what was legally documented and what was spiritually, emotionally, and culturally felt. And the more the APA deliberated, the more these threads intertwined. Votes cast, objections raised, minutes recorded. Yet the stories of those who lived through the classification, their letters, their diaries, their whispered legends, all pressed against the official narrative demanding acknowledgement. Objects disappeared, files gone from shelves only to resurface in unexpected hands, letters lost and mailed months later. Conflicting testimonies from psychiatrists, one account describing distress, another noting thriving social and professional lives. The duality of fact and folklore intertwined, creating tension, suspense, a haunting rhythm that pulsed through the heart of Philadelphia, through the offices of the APA, through the homes of the silenced. And as these layers unfolded, one could feel the inexorable push toward reckoning, toward recognition, toward a climax that would forever alter the course of psychiatric classification, civil rights and human dignity. Every lost document, every whispered legend, every hidden note converged like rivers toward a single ocean, the moment of transformation, a moment where fact and folklore, courage and fear, reality and myth collided. December 15th, 1973. Philadelphia. The APA headquarters loomed over the snow-dusted streets. The echo of footsteps on marble floors, the subtle hum of fluorescent lights. Papers shuffled, doors opened and closed, voices whispered in corridors. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, as if the walls themselves held their breath. The minutes of the meeting typed carefully detailed arguments, dissenting opinions, and cautious endorsements. Homosexuality does not meet the criteria for a mental disorder, the words read. Stark, resolute. Yet beyond the sterile text, the human drama unfolded. Dr. John Fryer, masked, still seated at the back, observing, heart pounding, fingers clenched, his anonymity both shield and burden. Every vote, every objection carried the weight of lives. Patients whose existence had been criminalized. Activists who had labored in shadows. Families whose love was forbidden. Outside, the city remained oblivious. Snow fell in silence. Streetlights casting cold halos on frozen sidewalks. Inside, the room pulsed with tension. Papers slid across polished desks. Whispered arguments clashing with formal language. We cannot continue to classify healthy individuals as disordered. One voice insisted, trembling yet firm. Another countered, citing tradition, precedent, the weight of decades of psychiatric authority. And then, the testimony. Letters read aloud. Patient diaries revealed anguish, fear, resilience. One account, voice shaking, described a young man fired from his teaching job, ostracized by family, living in constant fear. Another letter from a mother recounted how her son had been institutionalized merely for expressing love for a peer. The room felt charged, the past pressing down. Memories of patients whose lives were marred by misunderstanding, activists whose work had been ignored or lost. And intertwined with these facts, the folklore, whispers of the masked doctor, rumors of letters appearing mysteriously, files disappearing only to resurface in unexpected offices, legends of colleagues who, after hearing the truth, could not return to ignorance. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, pens falling from desks as if moved by unseen hands. A diary entry read aloud, "The truth is alive. It moves among us, silent, unseen, yet unstoppable." Each word reverberated through the room, a ghostly echo of courage and defiance. The tension mounted, votes were cast, hands shaking, the clerk recording each motion. The gavel hovered, a symbolic weight of centuries of judgment. And then, the final tally. The pronouncement echoed. Resolved. Homosexuality shall no longer be classified as a mental disorder. A silence followed. Heavy, electric. The collective intake of breath of those present. Some exhaled in relief. Others stared in stunned disbelief. Outside, the winter wind carried no hint of change. Inside, a revolution had quietly erupted. The impact was immediate, yet subtle. Patients received letters acknowledging the change. Some daring to return to work. Families cautiously accepting. Activists celebrated, quietly, knowing that the fight was far from over. And still, objects moved mysteriously. Files that had disappeared reappeared in strange places. The legend of the masked doctor grew, whispered in hallways and offices, in the apartments of those who had risked exposure, a folklore layer interwoven with fact reinforcing the mythic scale of the moment. The duality was palpable, a clash of bureaucracy and humanity, law and morality, fear and courage. Each human element weighed against the cold, rigid authority of classification. And the documents themselves, patient records, letters, minutes, diaries, all bore witness to the tension, to the danger, to the eventual triumph. Yet even in victory, shadows lingered. Outside, the streets of Philadelphia remained indifferent. State laws still criminalized love. Neighborhoods still whispered in caution. Landlords withheld leases. The broader society was slow to catch up. But inside, a template had been set. A precedent had been established. The struggle of individuals, the courage of activists, the persistence of hidden voices, all converged in a single declaration. And in the months and years that followed, the repercussions rippled outward. Academic conferences debated, newspapers reported cautiously, legislation hesitated, but the psychological and cultural shift had begun. And the folklore persisted. Stories of letters that vanished, of documents appearing unexpectedly, of a masked doctor whose identity was whispered across decades. Each anecdote reinforcing the weight of the factual revolution. The room in Philadelphia had become a nexus, a crucible where fact and legend, courage and fear, past and future, collided. Patients, activists, families, doctors, all threads in a tapestry stretched across the city, the nation, the world, and the diary entries, preserved under lock and key for decades, reveal the emotional toll, the sleepless nights, the whispered encouragements. We act now for those who will come after them, for the silenced, for the invisible, for love itself. The interplay of folklore and fact magnified the emotional resonance. Pens scratching furiously, letters mailed in secrecy files disappearing and reappearing. Each detail a brushstroke and a cinematic portrait of tension and triumph. By the end of the meeting, the convergence was undeniable. A crescendo of historical significance, human courage and whispered legend. A single declaration written in minutes, yet rippling across years, across the lives of thousands. Across the nation, the shadows of fear persisted, but now illuminated by a glimmer of justice. The climax was not loud. It was measured, deliberate, haunting. A moment suspended between the past and the future, between fear and freedom, between legend and reality. And as the camera of memory pans across the silent streets, the snow-covered city, the dimly lit offices, one can almost hear the echo of the gavel, the whispered testimonies, the flutter of papers, the heartbeat of a revolution that began in silence. A convergence of every thread, every hidden note, every lost letter, every whispered rumor, all colliding in a moment both historic and mythic. And in that convergence, the essence of the struggle, the human cost, the quiet triumph, the lingering shadows, all held together in a tension that would never fully release. The snow has settled over Philadelphia, streets glimmering in the cold light of early morning, offices emptied, chairs pushed under desks, the gavel's echo lingering like a ghost. Yet the story does not end. For every document archived, every letter filed away, every diary preserved under lock and key, there remain untold voices, lives unaccounted for, experiences hidden in shadows. The triumph of December 15, 1973, monumental though it was, could not erase fear, could not erase prejudice, could not erase decades of misunderstanding. Outside, the city moved on. Trolley bells rang, newspapers printed, children played in alleys. Yet beneath the ordinary hum of life, the echoes of that day persisted, whispers of courage that refused to be silenced. The masked doctor, Dr. John Fryer, became legend, a symbol of the unseen, the unheard, a reminder that change often begins in secrecy. And that truth, though fragile, can outlast fear. Families continued to navigate a world still hostile. Teenagers learned to read between the lines of society, discovering the courage to be themselves. And the folklore grew. Tales of letters vanishing from desks, documents appearing in impossible places, voices whispered in corridors long after the meeting had adjourned. Each story a reminder that history is alive, mutable, haunted by its own shadows. The archives themselves breathe. Typewritten pages ink faded, memos marked confidential, minute-by-minute records of courage, of dissent, of defiance. And yet even as scholars pore over these records today, as historians recount the events, one cannot ignore the human heartbeat beneath the text. The tension, the fear, the whispered conversations in apartments and basements, each fact layered with legend, each legend echoing fact, a continuous loop, an unresolved rhythm. The significance ripples beyond psychiatry, beyond Philadelphia, beyond 1973. It touches civil rights, social justice, the fundamental understanding that identity is not a disease, that love is not a crime, that courage often comes cloaked in invisibility. And still, questions linger. What other voices were silenced, lost to bureaucracy, to fear, to neglect? What stories remain hidden in cabinets, in drawers, in private diaries, waiting for the world to notice? What would have happened if the masked doctor had never spoken? If Barbara Giddings had not persisted? If Frank Kameni's letters had been discarded forever? The unanswered questions hover, thick, like fog over snow-covered streets. The APA's declaration was only a beginning, not an end. Each subsequent victory, each legal reform, each shift in society, all stand on that fragile foundation of courage, secrecy, and persistence. And as we leave this story, as the camera of memory pans over the empty offices, the faint glow of lamplight in distant windows, the quiet hum of a city oblivious to the moment that changed countless lives, we feel the tension of history unresolved. We remember that truth is rarely absolute, that progress is often invisible at first, that the human cost is rarely fully accounted for. And in that lingering uncertainty, in that pause between what was and what could be, the story continues. For every person who has ever been silenced, for every act of courage hidden in shadow, for every whisper that refuses to die. And so we ask, what other hidden chapters lie waiting in history's archives? What other masked voices still walk among us, unseen, yet indelibly altering the world? You have just witnessed one thread of a larger tapestry, a chapter of courage, fear, and resilience. But the story is far from over. It continues in whispers, in archives, and memories, in the courage of those who dare to speak. And now, we leave you with the question, the haunting motif that began it all. What truths remain hidden, waiting to be revealed? What echoes of history will you hear, if you listen closely enough? Follow, stay attentive, and bear witness, for these are stories that never truly end, and the next revelation may be closer than you think. Decades have passed since December 15th, 1973. Yet the echoes of that day ripple through history. Philadelphia's streets are no longer the silent witnesses of secrecy. The APA offices long emptied, but the legacy remains. Patient records, diaries, letters once hidden now reside in archives and libraries. Researchers and historians pore over them, tracing the lineage of courage, of defiance, of subtle, quiet revolutions. The voices of John Fryer, Barbara Giddings, Frank Kameny persist, like shadows stretching across time, reminding us that change is often invisible, measured not in headlines but in lives quietly reclaimed. The world shifted slowly. States began to repeal discriminatory laws. Employment protections evolved. Families cautiously embraced their children's identities. Love once criminalized began to breathe freely, yet always under the vigilant eyes of society. Even as legal recognition advanced, folklore of those early battles grew. Tales of the masked doctor, letters vanishing and reappearing mysteriously, whispered warnings in corridors, myths mingling with facts, creating a spectral echo of courage. One diary entry discovered decades later reads, "We act not for recognition but for justice, not for glory but for those unseen, those unheard," and in those words, the pulse of history beats, connecting past struggles to modern triumphs. Activists of today stand on the shoulders of those who fought invisibly, who challenged authority from the shadows, who dared to exist authentically against classification, persecution, and fear. Schools now teach civil rights. Universities archive letters and testimonies. Documentaries recount the masked doctor, yet the lived human experiences, the intimate courage, still resonate. In popular culture, films, books, and media reference these moments, yet folklore persists. Stories of documents that vanished, of voices that whispered in hidden rooms, of courage disguised in anonymity, reminding us that history is never fully settled. The legacy of December 15th, 1973 is not merely a date. It is a living reminder that change begins with courage, that classification cannot erase identity, that love defies law and prejudice. And today, as society debates civil rights, equality, and human dignity, as new generations navigate identities and acceptance, the echoes of those first brave steps remain, guiding, haunting, inspiring. What lessons linger from the shadows of APA offices, of secret diaries, of letters sent in secrecy? How much of our present is shaped by those who dared to speak even when the world insisted on silence? And as we ponder, we realize, the fight for recognition, dignity, and equality is never truly over. It lives in whispers, in archives, in every courageous act. And in that realization, we find the connective tissue between past and present, between fear and courage, between silence and voice. The story of December 15th, 1973, is a story that continues. In every step toward justice, in every fight against ignorance, in every act of authenticity. It is a legacy both factual and folkloric, tangible and ethereal. A reminder that even the smallest acts of courage can ripple across decades, unseen, yet indelibly altering the course of human experience. And now, as the winter wind sweeps across the city, as archives close and letters rest, we are left with one final thought, one haunting question. How many truths remain hidden, waiting for courage to unearth them? How many voices still masked, still unheard, continue to shape our world? The epilogue is not an end. It is an invitation to witness, to remember, to act, to honor those who dared, and to find the courage to continue. Decades after December 15, 1973, the shadows of that single declaration still stretch across the lives of millions. Societies once rigid in judgment, now slowly bending under the weight of courage. Laws that once criminalized love have been overturned. Marriage equality, workplace protections, anti-discrimination statutes, all rooted in part in the quiet revolution that began in those offices. Yet the human story persists. Every individual who dares to live authentically, every child discovering who they are, every activist challenging prejudice, carries a spark of that 1973 bravery. The Masked Doctor, Barbara Gittings, Frank Kameny. Their voices echo in the corridors of contemporary struggle, reminding us that progress is layered, not linear. Fact and folklore continue to intertwine. A legend whispered that those early letters, diaries, and memos contained truths not yet fully grasped. That courage leaves an imprint invisible to the eye. Modern generations inherit this legacy. They inherit the fight for recognition, for dignity, for equality. Every protest, every legal case, every classroom discussion about civil rights is a continuation of the struggle begun decades before. And yet, challenges remain. Bias, discrimination, and ignorance still persist. Even as society advances, the shadows of fear linger, reminding us that vigilance is eternal, that the cost of silence is universal. The story of December 15, 1973, transcends history. It is now alive in social movements, in online communities, and personal narratives. It is etched into human consciousness, reminding us that change is possible, that courage can ripple across time. But the question remains, how many voices are still hidden? How many truths lie buried in archives, in private letters, in unspoken confessions? And how will the generations of today and tomorrow carry the torch? As we reflect, as we bear witness, we realize that history is not a static record. It is a living conversation, between past and present, between courage and fear, between those who spoke and those who remain silent. And now, it is your turn. What truths will you uncover? What courage will you embody? How will you honor those who dared and ensure their fight continues? Leave a comment, share your thoughts, tell us where you are watching from, what echoes of history resonate within you. Engage with the story, because these are not just past events. They are threads woven into the fabric of humanity. Your voice, your awareness, your reflection continues the legacy. Follow, subscribe, and witness the untold stories, for history is never truly finished. And the next revelation, the next act of courage, may be yours to uncover.